Is it really that simple? Is it really that simple that Bitcoin is rallying going into the halving event and it's just going to continue to rally? Historically, we've seen Bitcoin actually local top in the pre-halving period, but ultimately later on turning this macro diagonal into a new support. Is that going to happen in this cycle as well? We're going to be talking about that in a lot of detail today. Subscribe to the channel for more videos like this in the future. Like this video if you enjoy content like this going forward, and let's dive right into it. So historically, we tend to see this macro diagonal across time at an 8-degree angle. In 2016, it rejected price just before the halving, prompting a pre-halving retrace of around 40% from upside wick to downside wick. That was 40% indeed. This pre-halving retrace occurred around a month or two, roughly a handful of weeks, in fact, before the halving. And this 40% retrace, if you discount the downside wick, it was more of a 30%, 29% retrace. But nonetheless, this macro diagonal preceded a rejection before being broken beyond after the halving and retested as a new support until we finally got a new all-time high 200 days roughly after the halving event. This is a tendency that repeated in the 2020 cycle as well. You can see here that we broke beyond this macro diagonal, retested it in the black circle right over here as a new support, and 200 days after the halving, we already saw a new all-time high for Bitcoin's price action. So if history is to repeat, we should be seeing a retest of this macro diagonal as a support, which is approximately at around 40K at this moment, or at least later on in the cycle it's going to be around 40K, maybe even a bit lower, because this macro diagonal is declining over time. So with each passing month it's going to represent a lower and lower price. So if we're going to be thinking about 200 days after the halving being a new all-time high, a few weeks before that we should be seeing a retesting in this black circled area here of the macro diagonal as a new support, probably around 40K or so. And then after that successful retest, we'll rally to new all-time highs 200 days after the cycle. That's what this historical tendency is suggesting to us. What's also suggesting to us is that we reject from this macro diagonal in the pre-halving period. We saw that in 2016, and we also saw that in 2019. But 2019 was a pre-halving year. But what's interesting about this is that we also saw rejections even in the halving year itself, still being a point of rejection in this halving year before the halving event, but ultimately breaking beyond this point. So the fact that we're seeing price action break beyond this macro diagonal, is this going to be a sustainable breakout? Or are we going to see something like 2019 where we saw upside wicking beyond this trend line? Because last month we saw an upside wick beyond this trend line already. So is it possible that we also see a rejection here and form an upside wick and ultimately remain below the trend line going into the halving, and then experiencing a pre-halving retrace and then somehow retesting this macro diagonal as a new support before rallying higher? That's something really to take into account, because a monthly candle close above here, that would be a history-defining, trend-defining, but momentous occasion for Bitcoin, because essentially it would be going against the grain of history, because the grain of history is suggesting to us that in the pre-halving period, we don't break beyond this macro diagonal sustainably. And by sustainably, I mean by producing monthly candle closes and managing to sustain itself above the macro diagonal. So this upcoming monthly close in 2 weeks' time is going to be a history in the making moment. Could we get this monthly close beyond here? Because if we do, then we'll probably see that pre-halving retrace occur, but that pre-halving retrace would figure as a retesting attempt of the black diagonal And so maybe we get that retest a little bit sooner, because historically we get that retest. Let's see, here in 2020, we got the retest 1, 2, 3, 4 months after the halving. In 2016, 1, 2, 3, 4 months after the halving as well. So if we were to get a retest of this black macro diagonal 4 months after the halving, shortly thereafter, we'd rally to new all-time highs. But the thing is, if we're going to get a monthly close right over here, then we might actually get that retest much sooner than that. And the question is, are we seeing a little bit of a accelerated cycle? So if you focus on this reaccumulation range right over here and essentially plot it in 2016, you can see that this reaccumulation range is very similar to what we're seeing right now in the cycle. However, this reaccumulation range occurred a little bit further away from the halving, approximately this amount of time. And you can see that if we were to do that to 2016, then at that same point in the cycle, Bitcoin was still in its range. So this range only saw a breakout some 2 months before the halving, whereas in this analogous range, we saw a breakout 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months before the halving. So does that mean that we're 4 months ahead of schedule, right? Because if we're breaking out 2 months before the halving here, and 6 months before the halving here, so technically 4 months earlier, if we're talking about a retest occurring of the black macro diagonal 4 months after the halving, if we're 4 months ahead of schedule, does that mean that we're going to get, instead of 4 months after the halving, we're going to get an actual retest around the halving event itself? Isn't that a mind-blowing realization? Isn't that a very interesting insight to see and try and understand if we are 4 months ahead of schedule, and as a result that means that the pre-halving retrace that tends to occur around the halving event itself is going to be that retest and retrace that enables that retest that tends to occur 4 months after the halving. What if we get it sooner rather than later? If that is the case, then that retest is going to be around the higher 40k levels. And whatever the case may be, still this retest is going to enable higher prices over time. But I just want to talk about the upside wicking for a bit more before we wrap up, because historically, if we look at this upside wicking beyond the macro diagonal, this was a 26% upside wick in 2019 before we rejected. Right now, if we're going to see a 26% upside wick in this cycle, that would mean that we're going to get to 56.5k before potentially rejecting there and monthly closing below the macro diagonal. History is suggesting this should happen. But what if the cycle is a little bit different? We have to try and understand the ways it could be different. But generally speaking, if we see a repeat of this upside wick beyond the macro diagonal, 56.5 should be that point of rejection that sends us back below the macro diagonal in time for the February monthly close below it. And then maybe we get some upside wicking beyond the trend line going into March, and then that pre-halving retrace once again. If history repeats, that's what we could potentially see. But we have to be open to the fact that we could see a monthly close beyond this trend line. And if that happens, we're going to see Bitcoin go against the grain of history. So is it really that simple? It's actually a little bit more complicated than usual, because history has been quite good to us in the sense that we've seen repeating patterns in the sense of reaccumulation ranges. We're seeing 2016 follow closely this cycle. For example, we've seen retraces around the pre-halving downside period. We've called the pre-halving rally quite nicely and accurately in recent times. So we're seeing these cycles still repeat, and history is repeating itself many times in this current cycle when we compare it to previous cycles. But we also have to try and see what are some of the ways that Bitcoin might not repeat. And one of the ways that it might not repeat the cycle of the past is if it monthly closes beyond here. So in any case, that's about it for today's video. Subscribe to the channel for more videos like this in the future. Like the video if you enjoy videos like this going forward. I'm Rekt Capital. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll speak to you in the next one. Speak to you soon.